So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This session is Indigenous Art for Teaching Elementary Math Concepts. I am Tammy Johnson, and this is brought to you by the Alberta Regional Professional Development Consortium, or ARPDC, and it's funded through Learn Alberta. I belong to the Edmonton Regional Learning Consortium, one of the 7 that are part of this group. And as I mentioned, I don't know if everybody heard that, but it was before I started recording. If you're in attendance or you've registered and can't attend the entire thing or aren't able to get here for some of those people, you do still receive a copy of the recording of the session as well as a copy of the Google Slides that I'm going to use. So resources and things like that you see in here, you can write them down if you like, of course, but you will get a copy of them as well. Do a land acknowledgement before we get going. So Tansei, I live on Treaty 7 land here in Calgary, which is the ancestral home of the Blackfoot people. There are also Dene people living here in Tsuut'ina and Métis. Oh, we didn't change that. Oh, now we've changed to region. So we're actually region number 5 and 6 here in Calgary, which I belong to region 5. And all have contributed to the shaping of Alberta and Canada. And I thank the Blackfoot particularly for allowing me to share this land with them. And if you know which area, or treaty area or settlement you live closest to, or if you're one of the 3 school divisions in Alberta that are not close to a treaty land, then you're welcome to put the name of the people the land that you're on that have been displaced from there. So I know quite a few people as I look through here. Well, we've got almost 30 in the session now. There are names that I definitely recognize. So welcome if you're back, and bear with me as I go through this information. It is necessary for 2 reasons, obviously to identify who I am, but just so that you understand my background and what informs me to do this work. Well, thank you, Tracy. She's in Treaty 6 and Métis Nation, yeah, Zone 4 and Treaty 7 as well for Celia. Thank you, guys. Yeah. If anybody wants to see where people are located and which treaty land, you can look in the chat. So as I said, my name is Tammy. Under ARPDC, we are called Designers of Professional Learning, which means that besides presenting these sessions for general consumption for the educators of Alberta and actually across Canada, anybody can access these sessions for free. And I've had people from many different places doing that. But besides doing that, we actually collaborate together. We work together on projects for curriculum. My main job this year in doing that is to help to inform other specialists in the core areas for the implementation of the new elementary program of studies. And what I do that is by helping them understand First Nations, Métis, and Inuit resources and how to use Indigenous ways of knowing within those subject areas. I am Red River Métis from what is historically known as the Red River Settlement in Manitoba, which is the name that was given to that area after the Canadian government came and took over the land going into the west of Ontario. And if you are Indigenous or if you know Indigenous people, you know we ask 2 main questions, and those are, what's your name and where are you from? Basically meaning who are your people and where's your land? So my land is in Selkirk, Manitoba, which is north of Winnipeg. My family's from St. Andrews, Manitoba, which is close by there. My mom is a Mowat, that's her maiden name. McDonald's, Mackays, and Beaudry are also part of my family. The Beaudrys in particular are a Alberta French voyageur Métis family. And my family did live in Alberta for quite a number of years in the 1800s. That's a picture of my great-grandfather, James Mowat, there in that picture, the gentleman by the rocks. And my family, his father, Andrew, and himself, they lived on land in both Fort Saskatchewan and Fort Edmonton. And they were forts at that time. And then in that area now, there is a school named James Mowat Elementary, named after my great-grandpa, and a park beside Mowat Park. And then in Edmonton, there's a street named after him, James Mowat Trail. Beside that picture, there's a picture of his 4 surviving children. My grandpa Ross is the middle boy there. I estimate that picture to be around 1906, I believe, Oh no, actually 1960. I keep saying that. I think it's 1916 actually, because my grandpa was born in 1910. I keep saying that in the wrong year because I actually think the picture of my great grandpa is late 1800s or maybe early 1900s there. So my grandpa's the middle boy there. Then his two brothers, Oliver and Stanley, and my great aunt Tassie and her Sunday best clothing there. I started off in Winnipeg as a teacher. My family is from Selkirk, and I spent most of my time there, other than when I was going to school. My mother had been going to school in Winnipeg, and I graduated from Seven Oaks School Division, which is where I began as a teacher in the core area of Winnipeg, meaning when we refer to the core area in Winnipeg, when I was there anyways, it referred to the central area of Winnipeg, which was the highest need area around Main Street and going down into Portage Avenue and in those areas. And so that's basically where I grew up and worked a lot with Indigenous students there, being the only Indigenous teacher in the school that I was teaching out on Main Street. I have over the years worked in just about everything, including mild, moderate programs for preschool kids up to teaching post-secondary for mainly, a lot of BIPOC students, and in terms of refugees, people of trying to upgrade their education or learn more so that they can continue on to post-secondary and just about everything except for high school math and science and the trades. A couple of years ago, I worked on a project with Kataskanau Tribal Council, KTCA, and online program Ignite eLearning. And I took their outreach program, grades 7 to 9. And based on the seasons of fall, winter, spring, and as well as land-based learning, which we're now moving to culture-based learning in terms of that. And then also added the Cree language and indigenized it for their particular area and then decolonized it for them. Worked with them, their specialists were amazing. And then I was encouraged to continue this work, to do this, and really looking at particularly supporting non-Indigenous teachers or educators and Indigenous educators as well, because I am now just learning about more of the Cree part of my background. I always knew I was Métis, I always was raised with a lot of those things, but my grandpa spoke Cree and I was never allowed to learn that language. And we weren't really allowed to learn anything about the Cree part of our family, the Métis especially in that area, very colonized because of having to hide their background because of the political situations that happened back in the day. Without getting into all that, because that's not what this session's about, but you can always look into that yourself if you'd like. So anyway, that's been kind of my journey as well. So I, as a individual learning Cree, I'm on my 4th session come this January at Misconwa here in Calgary with the elders there, and I practice Cree spirituality, go to ceremony regularly, I drum, do all those things. So those are not necessarily typical of Métis people, but there are many of us who do that, especially now that we're regaining parts of our culture. But that's who I am, and that's where I've been working in, and really hoping to help teachers demystify some of this stuff. But also just helping. I know the two main things teachers always say to me is that they are afraid to appropriate, from Indigenous peoples, and they're afraid that they're going to be disrespectful. So that's part of what I hope to help teachers with. So besides the curricular areas that I deal with in this particular presentation and others, I also present on specific Indigenous issues that relate to education as well. Okay. Was not working when I clicked. Before we continue, I am going to show you the ARPDC resources in regards to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, because there are quite a number of really great resources that have been developed that I always say is a good place to start if you're unsure and you're looking for resources. They're Alberta resources created by Alberta teachers, so it's a great place to start. So Empowering the Spirit is an amazing website. And I know I repeat myself, but I don't think I can say it enough. This website is, when I'm researching, I find it all across Canada, referred to on post-secondary sites for education programs in particular, but others as well, and library services. And I've seen it referenced in the United States as well. Orange Shirt Day and beyond, as you can see, there's foundational knowledge, leading the learnings, classroom supports, and then Orange Shirt Day and beyond. I always say if you're going to do nothing else, because I know teachers are super busy, always look at this site, because this, if you go down to teaching tools, it has some really great resources there, leveled posters for things like Orange Shirt Day, sharing circles, and all kinds of other stuff on there too. So that's always a good place to start. And then on the search engine, if you go to find resources by focus, first I'm going to go down to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And then you're going to see that all of these resources come up. And there's a link as well to Empowering the Spirit, but Education is Our Buffalo, and Our Way is a Valid Way are resources that I had paper copies of back in the day. And they are all being updated, as well as they're trying to translate all of them into French as well, so on français. You can search by audience if you want to sort them by level or by type. So yeah, I just point that out to you guys because those are available and they've already been created, and you might as well start there. But I do want to get onto the session, so I have enough time to do that. And I do try to leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions or comments, or if you've got resources you'd like to share as well. I have done quite a few different sessions in this area about math. And so I definitely made this one way more specific. And I know that I've had people who've attended some sessions say, it's too generalized, but there's been little work done in this area. And so my first priority with other sessions when I first started, particularly, were simply to get those resources out to teachers, because I have the time to research. I have the time to do this work because that's what I'm paid for. Whereas teachers do not have necessarily the time, and also are not sure if resources are good ones to be using. Sometimes it's hard to know what is okay if it hasn't been vetted for you already. And so that's my focus on this one is more specific. And I've done a session as well on beading and weaving. So I do have a few references in here to that are similar, but not as detailed, because in that session I go into great detail as well there and giving you quite a few resources. In this one, I really want to focus on some art. And so looking at art, and art shows up in different ways. So I do want to first look at, this is a PDF version of a webinar that's available through the U of Vic, and I'm not going to go through the entirety of the webinar, but I do want to point this out, and you will have this link available to you when you receive the slides. And I believe, because I was looking on YouTube, I believe this is also available online, but I just wanted to show, because they did have some really great points in here, and why recreate something if you don't need to. And I do always talk about this as well, the impact of worldviews. And I, again, do a separate session just on worldviews. And I've had that requested a number of times for school divisions, and even did one in person to work on that. And decolonizing, the worldview of the Western education world is a task in itself, but just getting that kind of into teachers' minds and thinking about it. But those differences are quite specific. And really, the main thing that I would have to say, without having to get into a whole session on that here, is just the interconnectedness of everything. And even when we look at, say, art in the Indigenous experience, it's just part of life. It's not, and I would say that's probably true for most cultures. I would say that, art isn't something that anybody ever thought of, well, other than maybe some of the Europeans, when we start getting into, like the Renaissance and, some, when we get into some of these, different kinds of painters, and when it became a thing, and it was a funded thing by, the rich, in that kind of sense, when we talk about that, right? But when we remove that money part of it, when we remove that monetary push on art, and we just talk about what it's for, really, it's that expression of your own culture. If we talk about the clothing designer, we talk about, even on for Indigenous people, on the side of a teepee, if something was decorated, or, in terms of the Indigenous First Nations, as well as Métis, beading things, and showing who you are as a people, right? I mean, we talk about cultures all around the world do that sort of thing as well. And so they're not things that are uncommon for all of our people, right? That's just a human condition that we live with. But when we look at that, we want to talk about, Indigenous ways of knowing when we're doing it, so that we can impart that to the kids in the classrooms when we're teaching about this, when we're infusing it. So it doesn't just become looking at Indigenous art. How does that affect Indigenous culture? What does that mean to Indigenous people? Just like you would do with any other art that you were going to teach, say if it was Ukrainian or German or whatever it might be, that, you know, the people that are living around that particular area where you are and the kids that are in that classroom, you do the same thing, right? So really, again, I just look at what's your responsibility as a Canadian and as an educator, right? And that's in this slide is like to learn the true history of our country. And, you know, yes, there's things in here, but intergenerational trauma and things like that. But I think using the art part of it is a really great focus, right? We can maybe get away from some of that stuff for a little while, and we can really look at the joy and the beauty and in you know, Indigenous expression in terms of, you know, you know, how do we feel joy beyond those things that have happened to us, right? Um, and look at the impact too. We can look at the impact of colonialism when we're doing some of these things. How has Indigenous art changed? That is something you could definitely look at, right? But I think really looking at why do we integrate Indigenous ways of knowing, and this slide to me was really the important thing, right? So build those strong relationships with your students, you get to know them, because using Indigenous ways of knowing does that. It's that collaborative learning, and that's one of those lessons I'm going to show you definitely does that. It's collaborative as well, and it's hands-on, it's experiential, looking at different strategies for solving problems and utilizing reflexive and reflective learning, you know, that holistic learning using stories, learning on and from the land, all these things, right? We honor culture, so that's really important. Again, you guys can go through these more in detail if you so choose. It's more geared towards obviously specifics, you know, of Indigenous ways of knowing, but I think it's just a really important thing to engage your mind to think about before we get going on this and talking about just the math, right? You can't separate out subjects for us, right? For Indigenous peoples, you can't, like, there's no math, English, or well, or language, period. You know, science and social studies. There isn't. There's just learning, and so that categorizing of learning is very much a Western way of doing it, and so that isn't an Indigenous way of doing it. So when we look at some of these things, we need to look at it from a holistic perspective, right? Not only holistic from the learning point, but also holistic for the children. We're looking at them in terms of the idea of the medicine wheel and balance and things like that. So just keeping those things in mind when we're looking at this. Where I'm going to take you guys is to a website called UCubed first. We're going to look at this. And it is through Stanford Graduate School of Education. And the reason I love this too is because two of the educators that were involved in doing this are from Alberta, which is exciting. So we have Kyoko Ora, who has her Master's of Education, you see on the right-hand side here. So she's Okanagan descent, and she was involved in doing this, and as well as Jennifer Paulson Brand, and she was also working on this, okay? So both of them are non-Indigenous teachers, but they were involved in working on this and in their Treaty 7 areas. So this particular lesson focuses on Indigenous mathematical art, which is why you're here, right? So we're going to look at this lesson that they used, and the image that they've used is described as a dream catcher, but it's done in an artistic form. And so it really is getting kids to look at math through a different lens and 3D images and looking around the room and really talking about Indigenous people and the way that you can look at art for them. And so as well, if you look here at the very bottom, there's some examples as well of Indigenous art that are using different forms. And so it's interesting, right? Because if we, again, we can talk about that traditional art and we can look at traditional Indigenous art and then we can compare it to these modern artists. How has that changed their perspective? How has the effect of colonization changed some of their art as well? Right? I think that that's really interesting. You know, and especially when you look at a couple of these, you know, they're one's Métis, you know, the other one is you know, Anglo and Celtic ancestry in Australia. So this is an Australian artist, you know, along with his Indigenous background, and that's for me as well. Is I am Scottish Métis, and so Scottish Métis, I have very much a Celtic, and my Celtic upbringing too, and beliefs very much match up with Indigenous beliefs, whether you believe that or not. Things like the solstice and things like the moon cycles, and a lot of beliefs about plants and animals and everything being equal, and those sorts of things are very much aligned, but it's a different perspective as well. And in the art of that influences that, if you look, especially the Métis artists, when you look here, kind of those in the colors and things like that. So I think it's a really cool place to start. So we are going to look at this lesson then in some quite detail. So this is from a First Nations school, and this is this project from U Cubed. And don't ask me to say this word because I do not want to mess it up. I believe it's probably Salish, I want to say. But it's from the Okanagan Nation, and I am learning Cree, so I am not going to destroy their language. So they start off with explaining their background on doing this particular lesson. And I think it gives a really great basis for how you could frame a lesson, how you could take any kind of artwork that you're using, that you might find some images that have, either shapes or, even looking at Cartesian, planes and things like that, talking about how can we, put this even onto a graph and that sort of thing. Lots of different ideas, but this hopefully will spark some ideas for you as well, give you some of your own ideas. And I always like to say that too, that as teachers, you really have to, and I know everybody's like, give me a lesson, give me this and give me that. And I'm like, well, you know what though? It's really important, I think, that again, to be authentic, you need to take this information and apply it to what lessons that you're doing, and thinking about how can I take Indigenous work that may be local to where I am, because I always say go local, and apply that to the work that you're doing in your school so that you can really make that authentic. And I know that could be tough at first, but once you try it, I think it gets a lot easier. So we'll look at this, right? So they were invited to work with these elementary and middle school kids, right? And they shared an image, and there's on slide 5, I'm going to show you. And they do have the questions on there, and they ask them these questions. So what do you see? What do you think of when you see this image? And what does this image mean to you? And so they were given a wireframe copy of the shape where they could draw and write about their ideas. And then they described the image as a dream catcher, which is interesting, right? I don't think anybody told them that, but that's what they thought of. And then they shared the meaning of the image for themselves, their families, and their culture. So they had to look at their particular background and what does that mean. And a lot of the students there would have first been First Nations, but not necessarily all of them, right? Because we would do mixed classrooms. And then so after they did that, they asked them what they noticed with the image. What do you see? And they said that they saw a book, a laptop, a river, a medicine wheel, a house, right? They also saw shapes, so triangles, parallelograms. Some saw 3D images. They had like a room with walls. And so they went on and they did this sharing for over 10 minutes, which, if you think about kids and math, sharing about talking about an image for 10 minutes or more is quite astounding, right? I know when I've done math lessons, to get them to talk even for a couple of minutes can be like pulling out that information, right? Can be tough. And so this is really important too. At the very bottom where it says they shared with the students that mathematics is a lens that we can lay on the world. And when we do that, we see more. So I think that's a really cool way to go about it, right? And then they said also that they like to mathematize different shapes. And so I showed this lesson, this whole actually presentation, to a friend of mine last night. And she's an artist. She just did an art show here in Calgary, the under 100 show. So you could buy art $100 or less at. And she saw this, and she said she didn't really like math when she was in school. Not a surprise, a lot of people say that, right? It wasn't my favorite subject either, I have to say, unfortunately, because it didn't involve enough hands-on stuff, right? But she saw this, and especially because she loves art, she's like, oh, I would have loved doing this as a child. This would have made me far more interested in what I was doing in math. So I thought I'd do that as an encouragement as well, especially to rope in those kids that don't necessarily like math, but they're really great at art. So part 2 of this was the mathematizing piece of it, right? So they're taking this with the kids and trying to get them to understand this now from a mathematical perspective. So then they're asking them specifics. So they started off with the generalizations. So what do you think you see in here? Now we're going to talk about what are the specific math things. So how many triangles do you see? Right? And it was interesting, right? Because some of the kids said infinity A few of them said that. And so they wanted clarification from the kids. And some of the students, like, they justified it by saying they could divide any triangle into two more triangles. And they could continue to divide this. This is very interesting, right? To get kids to say this, I think, especially at that age, that, you know, they could continue to divide it and divide it and divide it. This reminds me as when I was a child and I sat, when we did have the cereal boxes that had the picture of the person on the cereal box looking at the cereal box. And I kept thinking, this goes on for infinity, because there's forever, forever and ever and ever. There's a person on the box looking at a box. That's what reminded me of. As soon as I read that, I was like, oh, that's very interesting that they said that, right? But with triangles. And then the next step, they wanted to refine the question. So then they asked, how many equal sized triangles do you see? And this is also interesting too, right? So the kids determined a unit triangle and color coded the triangles on their wireframe handout. Some of them cut out congruent triangles and the tile shape. And then when they asked them to share their answers, their conjectures of what they think was happening, they wrote their names next to their contribution and they engaged in conversation about the difference between equal-sized triangles, triangles having the same area, and congruent triangles. And I don't think I ever had a conversation like that in a classroom when I was teaching, and definitely not when I was a student. So I think that just to get kids to think about that is pretty amazing, right? Just from using the art. And then they discuss a number of triangles each student, and then they broke the shape into, since the number of triangles depends on the size of the unit triangle. So the student work shown below on the left, so we've got on the left-hand side here, the blue and the white and the red, shows the number of congruent triangles is 28. And then the student work on the right shows triangles of the same size, and the count is 56. So that's very interesting, right? So what their goal was to get the students to unitize the image in their way so they could determine the fraction of percentage of each color of the shape. So now we've gone from this speculation about what do they see in there. So in the world, how does math show up in the world? Now we're taking this and we've taken this idea to actually get them to compare different kinds of triangles and to understand what those triangles are, which is amazing, because most kids, yeah, I know when you ask them what's, going on with these triangles, they couldn't tell you a lot of them except for maybe 2 or 3 in your classroom, right? But now they've actually taken the work and they've tried to figure out how many congruent triangles they have and how many, are the same size, and just it's mind-blowing to me that they've done this. So here's the image, right? This is what they showed them. So so what do you think of when you see this image? And this is where they got all these different ideas of what this could possibly be. And then, they came up with the Indigenous part of it. They came up with that it was a dream catcher, right? And then what does it mean to you? So coming over the different ideas of what it could possibly mean. And then they zoomed in. So as you can see right there, so it's not a simple image, like this is a complex image. We've got, and even just because the rounded edges around there with the triangle piece, they're not specifically triangles, it's in a circle. So I find that interesting as well. So then this was the part of it where they asked them, how many triangles do you see? And then how do you see them? Do you see triangles that are the same size? And how many of the same size triangles fill the entire shape? And so this would be amazing as well, right? If you're going to show it on a smart board with the kids, you guys are seeing it on your screen, but imagine it that much bigger. So then I think that gives a really good visual, plus the colors in it. Then we get into, so this will be the last part of it, right? Which fraction of the shape is orange, which fraction of the shape is yellow, and which fraction of the colors can you find? So this is also very interesting as well. And I wonder too, for me, part of the complex part of this for myself as a visual learner is the fact that, are we just looking inside this image where these angles are? Or are we also counting the part that's rounded? That would be a quandary for me as a learner. So I'm not sure if they actually identify that, quite honestly. But again, so we talk about focus on shape, right? So this is part 3. And this is where I would be confused, right? A little bit, or wondering about what's going on. So here when they asked the students to list the fractions of the shape by color on the board, and then they organized a table so that they could say what fraction of the shape was orange. So they made a table, on the screen to do this as well. And once they filled it, they discussed the answers that they entered into the table, talked about the answers and how they'd been determined and how similar or different the answers were. Then they discussed equivalent fractions and how they shared the same amount of area but were written differently. So then they got to have a discussion about estimation and how sometimes answers are not exact. So we've got like so many concepts in here in math and talking about, like, and what I really love about this is that this is how Indigenous people learn, right? There isn't a straight line. There isn't a, A plus B equals C all the time, because it's always, well, what about this? And what about that? Well, I see it this way. You see it that way. Okay, so how did that work? Right? And so no matter what the discussion is, that's what it is. And so getting the kids to really think in that open-ended way for math, I think, is exactly what we want as educators, right? We in that whole, I remember when that math curriculum came out, when they wanted everybody to be, get the kids to, do all of these things, like we're just what we're talking about now. And I remember as a teacher thinking, how am I supposed to do this with math? I was never taught like that in school, right? But now when I look at it, I think this is how I was taught to think when I was with my grandparents. This is what I was always taught to do, to question things and ask questions and just really explore. And if I had been able to do that in school, I think I would have understood math a whole lot better. That would have made a lot more sense to me, because now when I look at it this way, I'm like, this is amazing. And I think that especially for those kids who are not interested in math the way that they've been taught, I'm doing everything in a linear fashion. This is amazing. So when they were done their lesson time, they left the class with circles so that they could make their own dream catcher images. And so that's really cool as well, right? And basically, I love at the end here where they talk about this, right? So they returned back to, to Stanford, and one of the teachers that they had left, it was a grade 6, 7 teacher, she extended the idea of their lesson. So she invited the students to design their own dream catchers, but she gave them space to activate their prior knowledge. So what she did was she tied it into what they had already done, which is perfect, right? That's exactly what you want to do. And then what she was calling this was, cultural capital. So she focused on working on a big idea of mathematical patterns. So after they made their dream catchers and they studied their patterns, she took their thinking into the realm of algebra and helped the kids describe their patterns using functions. Now I know this isn't, but it's grade 6. They're starting to do some of this, right? So this is that idea here in this activity. Um, so it'll take just a minute. I didn't put it into this lesson. I maybe could have, but I didn't. It is a link in there. Just a second here. Sit while I'm waiting. If it takes too long, I won't be able to. Anyways, but oh, it's coming up perfect because it's got mostly images. I just wanted to show you that. So we're talking about the patterns, right? So talking about what do we know about patterns already, and they used a Jamboard. They looked at how to create their own patterns, and then they had, a friend identify, describe, and extend their patterns. What could they do with it? And then they also inquired into the form and function of patterns and the connections we can make between patterns in our everyday life, which is amazing, right? So we've connected it to everyday life as well as land-based learning. And then after they had put everything together, this is some of what they came up with. And then they created their own dream catchers using symbols, images, pattern blocks. And I love that because you give them all kinds of different ways that they could do it. Then they talked about the function of patterns. So now we're getting into that algebra part, right? Once they're done, they posted them on the wall and they did a gallery, which is also so cool, right? So we tie in the art as well. Then she introduced variables. So cool, right? Talking about that. And then one of the students dream catches patterns. They worked on trying to figure out an equation that could represent her pattern function for hexagons to triangles. And they all worked together to come up with that. So, and right, and then they looked at, what's a variable in your formula, and they weren't sure. So, and this is where I love it. She says, we were in the learning pit. right? So this is, to me, is an amazing way to do math, and far more interesting, that I would have been engaged so much more when I was younger if this was the case, I have to say. And then, yeah, so this is what they ended up with. So I think, yeah, I just think this is an amazing way to learn math. But anyway, so that's that lesson. I'm going to leave that one there, in terms of like looking at specific art. So I think that's a really cool way to go about it. I do want to include a little bit about beading and weaving, and just talking a little bit about this as well, because it is art still, right? We can talk about that. And like I said, I do a full session on just the beading and weaving, but I've included a few things in here to show you. And this is a super short video just to give you an idea of how to use technology with math to look at basket weaving. Super short.
The project uses Jupyter notebooks to recreate traditional Salish patterns for basket weaving. When we say notebook, it's just an internet page that has a header and a bunch of different functions and buttons that you can access. And then within the sections, you can enter Python code. And the idea is through very simple steps, recreate very complex patterns.
Teaching patterns at a young age is important. For one, I think sometimes students kind of get scared of math once they start seeing symbols. And so I think when you introduce images and shapes, it helps with mathematical thinking. The idea was to allow people to learn about these patterns, create new patterns, storing traditional patterns, and the passing of knowledge to future generations.
Yeah, so that's the Simon Fraser University, and that's a project that they worked on. Sorry, I'm just going to go to the next page. And so I think so weaving is another area that we can look at, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but there's patterns, especially in weaving, that we can look at. Beading is another area that we can really get into, and so I'm going to go through this in a little more detail, especially because I think the beading section is probably a bit easier to do in the school setting. So this is an article, it's a little bit older, but it was in Prince Rupert, and it was talking about this educators there that rose to the challenge of incorporating Indigenous culture into math class. And it does include information on cedar weaving as well too. So it does refer to that. And a lot of articles do include both beading and the weaving as well. And so here they're talking about, they've got a workshop, math workshop, tables full of materials. They've got faux cedar strips, dry erase markers, dice and scissors. And so they're looking at, how can they incorporate more Indigenous ways of knowing into their classrooms for math and the curriculum. And so they started looking at that through the lens of weaving to start. And I have to say, because unfortunately there isn't a lot of that in Alberta, but there is willow weaving, right? So you could refer back to that, and you could use faux type materials for that, because willow, particularly when you get it, I know because we make our sweat lodges out of it here too, you have to use it right away, because obviously once you cut it down, it starts to dry out and it gets tough. So you could use some materials that imitate that as well when willow is wet still, so that you could do that. So you could have some thicker materials and do that and use it for weaving. So that's a possibility here to, add that. And then also, like they're talking about that with the older kids, they do introduce those math concepts like algebra and algorithms using weaving as well. And it's really important too, I think, like there's this, and I'll just highlight this particular quote because I really like this, that weaving is a really great metaphor for the whole unit of doing this work when they're doing it, because it shows the concepts that are woven together and throughout different grades and levels. And again, that idea that you can't separate Indigenous ideas out from one another, right? They're all interwoven with each other. So that's important. And I think it's also important to show that Indigenous people have always done math. I think that's a really important thing to show, because I know even when I started the project with KTCA, it wasn't a matter of not knowing Indigenous people did math, because everybody did it, but it was like, how do you show that Indigenous people knew this, because I think all too often in Canada, I know particularly I can't speak to the United States because haven't lived there, but I know there's horrendous things that have gone on there. But I know for myself, even growing up where I grew up, it was that Indigenous anything was considered inferior, and I think that's a narrative that has been long preserved in Canada, unfortunately, due to colonialism. So wherever we can show not only Indigenous kids themselves, the intelligence and the knowledge that has been available for thousands of years here, but also show non-Indigenous kids that this is available as well. That Indigenous people have always done math and science, right? These are things that they've always done, but it was something they did on the land because this is where they were and this is how they lived. So I think that through art, we can show that, like the weaving it's a practical thing, yes, for sure, right? It's a practical thing, but at the same time, it's something beautiful and there's pattern in it and there's different things that are done with it. So I think that we can show that as well, that there is math being used in it in order to create those shapes that you see. So anyways, this is an article that you can read. And again, too, that authenticity piece is thrown in. It's just, I always push with people, right? We need to be authentic when we're doing that. And then we can look at specifically beading. And these are articles more that give you some of the pedagogy background, but and like if anybody does want a copy of the session that I do on beading and weaving, which is way more detailed and you haven't been able to see it, just you can send me an email as well, and I'll repost my email address at the end so that you can contact me for that. Yeah, so this is in grades 5 and 6, so this is pretty cool. So this is an Ojibwe artist, and she comes and she shows the kids how to use beading to learn math, and they're using a loom, and so creating patterns, right? And I know that I've had a teacher, I can't remember her name, she actually got an award in Manitoba for doing this as well, for doing the beading patterns, and they did it on I think, I don't know if it was Desmos, but it was another program. I'm sure she's in here, she'll tell me. Just been a lot of things going on lately. But it's really important. And just so you know, in New Brunswick, University of New Brunswick, there's a program, and there's a link in this article too, to something called Show Me Your Math. And it is from the East Coast, but it's got some really great ideas in terms like things like beadwork and drum and paddle making. And I always talk about this. Like I'm involved in drum making now because I have a friend who has taught me. What she likes to call herself a maker, but she's really a culture bearer, Flora Johnson, and she's been teaching me how to make all the things, right? And there's math involved in making the drum as well, right? Like if you actually measure it out, if you want to do that, like not traditionally, it wasn't necessarily measured specifically, right? The way that we measure things. When you measure out the drum, you have to do estimation. You have to figure out the size of the your rim and what you're going to use and how you're going to put that around, and then you're going to have to stretch out the material, and then you have to punch holes into it, and you have to do that in a very it's a geometric shape, and it has to be very equal. So you have to look at equivalencies and things like that too, right? So there's a lot of math involved in doing these things. So there's also that resource that you can take a peek at and see if it's available as well. All right, so now we're going to look at, there's a lesson plan here. Yes, I do have a lesson plan. I'm going to show you that on a wampum bead project. And of course, this is more the East Coast, Ontario. It's a wampum, but it's a lesson plan for you. So it's right, talking about that pattern repetition, and then gets into jewelry making. And so you can refer to things like, on the fishing line too. So you could even get into talking about Indigenous fishing. And there's also history that you can teach too, right? So you can infuse that in talking about the beads that people have used here in Alberta, beading, obviously shells that were found around the waterways and things like that. But we also have those diamond willow, the seeds when they dry, they are so hard, right? You can drill a hole through it. And a lot of those were used for beading, and some like the very tiny ones, especially for different projects. And so, and even some of those I believe can be cut, like they can be dyed. They're dark to begin with, but it's like be dyed different colors. And so you could even talk about the plants and things like that are around that were used to dye them. So there's all kinds of different things you can get into. But there is a section I know in the curriculum talking about wampum belts, right? For I think it used to, and they might have changed because I know they're changing the social studies curriculum. It used to be grade 6, I believe. But there's that section in there. But just talking about using that fishing line as well with the bead and putting it together, and then coming up with tying it into social studies as well too, right, for your elementary classroom, because now you got this trade item that was used as well as using it for a treaty item too, right, to negotiate treaties. I'm going to go through a little bit more because I know I'm going to start running out of time. I'm looking at my clock. And then for elementary, we've also got, there's this, a seminar I'm going to show you. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but there's a seminar here that I found as well. It's a math seminar, and it's called The Art of Beating Using Math. And now it is the United States, so it's Navajo, but the Navajo are Dene. So you guys know, if you didn't know this. So I know their culture is different, obviously, than the Dene people in the north and the Tsuut'ina here in the south in Alberta. But I think there's a great way to tie that in and explain, because the Dene people themselves are the largest group of Indigenous people as a nation all throughout Turtle Island in North America. So from the north, right, in Canada, going into the south here, going into, like I said, New Mexico, Arizona, that area, and then even into the Midwest and getting down, into, gosh, where else are they? I'm trying to remember. They're like they're all over the place. So this is another thing you can discuss with children in terms of, you're doing math, but you can talk about the Dene people and how vast and different their cultures are across, Turtle Island and North America. But anyways, there's all these lesson plans in here talking about pixel art, and you can see like they've got all this, there's some great stuff in here, and they even use the metric system, even though it's the United States. So it's really great. They use a peyote stitch was one of the main, like that's the most versatile stitch and the one that's available the most in the States, and probably one that people would identify quite often, right? Because a lot of that Northwest kind of art is very prevalent. Now we're talking about quadrants, right? So we're getting into Cartesian planes, and, talking about virtual bead looming. So yeah, there's tons of stuff in here for you guys to go through and look at in terms of the math pieces. And I think we've got some links as well to some other resources, but just those cultural links as well. And even just starting to discuss the vastness and the variety of, particular cultures. Like Korea are the largest group in all of Canada, but even talking about the vastness and difference of them and comparing it to the Dene across North America. This is a PDF that I really love because it's got a life in beads, and it's really talking about the artworks. If you look at the art on here too, and what you're learning about beads, this would just be a secondary source to show kids about, because we live on the plains in Canada for the most part. And, talking about the stories about the plains dress and what stories does it tell through that artwork and through the math that's involved in doing it. What kind of story does it tell? And you can look at some of these outfits there, it's amazing, the detail and the adornment on these outfits, and the amount of hours. And that's another thing I always know when I'm taking a Métis course right now through Rupert's Land Institute, and it's really driving home, how the women in our cultures really did not get the kind of recognition that they should have in terms of the hard work and the artistry that they have done. So I think that's also something else to point out. This is a link to that virtual bead loom that is available in that one lesson, but also I've used it to show people as well. So there's a link to that, and I believe that teacher that I have highlighted from Winnipeg has also done this here. But there's all the links here to the cultural context, the fabrication, there's even science connections on here, and there's a tutorial for the software as well that you can use. And it's apparent, I think that it's pretty easy to teach kids this program. And this is the lesson plan that uses the virtual bead loom as well. So again, making those connections, and you can really look at that bead work that has been done. You can do lots of ties, First Nations and Métis as well, and looking at, what are the different kinds of beading that is available, how is this artwork done, how is it organized, the amount of, just even talking about like having to gather all these materials before Europeans were here. How did you get these materials before there was trading for beads and things like that? And then, of course, I do have more details on weaving. I will show you one before we, because I did show you the video earlier on about the Simon Fraser University, but I'm going to show you weaving math because this is a really important resource. And there's a few other on here as well. This is one I've used quite often in math sessions as well, the weaving math. So this is from BC. And I really enjoy this one because it has lots of visuals in here, but it goes from like, this shows you, it's got the pre-calculus for grade 10, but if we go down here, as you can see, it's got information for kindergarten, grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and getting into junior high, right? So it's got all the elementary stuff that we can look at using the Salish weaving. Now, I also think personally that you can also tie in the Métis finger weaving with this and use some of that idea, right? And talk about that. This one in particular uses Desmos, which is, I love that as an extension in Google Chrome. If you wanted to use that with kids, and it does give a lot of details on how to do that. So I think that's also important. And of course, that would be the older kids doing that. But I think you could start with the younger ones and looking at finger weaving, for Métis finger weaving for the little guys, and introducing this idea to them until you get them into the grade 5 or 6 area where they could start to look at using some of this stuff. Yeah, and I'm going to finish up there. You guys can always look at those other resources that I have for you, and as well as this one. There's, it's a whole, I'll just show you the image of it. This is a document that's 26 pages long, integrating Aboriginal culture with mathematics K-12 from Port Alberni. And it's just got, it's a bit older, but it does have some really good ideas. And it's still in terms of incorporating Aboriginal culture. And of course, a lot of the cultural stuff they're incorporating. Again, like I said, drums are also a form of art. So you can always talk about those things, right? Because there's artistry involved in doing them. Not necessarily in the back of the one drum that I did, because I made it so I could hold on to it, but I'm going to decorate it with ribbons and feathers. But there's it's so intricate, can't even speak, intricate ways of, making drums and decorating them and making the backs of them look so beautiful, and talk about the shape of the animal and how that's done, and anyways, all that stuff. I could go on for days. But I am going to leave it at that, and I'm going to stop share here as well so that I can open it up to you guys. I'm going to stop recording.